Rikers Island on the brink. The secret collapse nobody can stop. The day the island stopped breathing. Imagine guards walking off the job, inmates breaking out of their cells, and ambulances racing across a crumbling bridge. On this day, Rikers Island wasn't just dangerous, it was out of control. Inmates set fires in the cell blocks, alarms blared non-stop, and one desperate officer sent a final radio call. "We've lost the tier." Repeat. "We've lost the tier." That was the moment it became clear. Rikers Island wasn't just failing. It was collapsing. But the real question is, how did the most infamous jail in America reach a point where nobody, guards, city leaders, or even the government, could stop its fall? The cracks in the walls. Years before the chaos, small signs of collapse were already showing. Broken locks that never got fixed. Toilets that overflowed for weeks. Shortages of guards so bad that some units went hours without supervision. For the inmates, it meant living in filth. For the officers, it meant fear every single shift. But city officials kept saying, "We've got it under control." Still, everyone inside knew something else. Control was already slipping. And then one night, a fight broke out over something small, a stolen commissary snack. It should have been easy to stop. But no officers were around. The fight grew into a riot, with dozens of men stomping and swinging until one inmate was left bleeding on the concrete. That was the first real crack. The vanishing guards. As violence grew, guards began leaving. Some quit. Others called out sick. Entire shifts were understaffed. Inmates noticed. And once they realized the doors weren't always locked, the balance of power shifted. One day, prisoners in a housing unit refused to lock in for count. Instead, they surrounded the lone officer, shouting, "You don't run this tier anymore." He pressed his radio in panic, but backup never came. The system was too thin, stretched to the breaking point. The officer made it out alive, but the message was clear. Rikers Island was no longer fully controlled by staff. The fires. With fewer guards, chaos spread. Inmates began setting fires in their cells, not just to protest but to send a message. Smoke filled entire corridors. Prisoners banged on doors, chanting through the haze. Fire alarms screamed, but evacuation was impossible. Locked gates trapped men in smoke-filled tiers. Guards had to choose, risk their lives rushing in or wait for the flames to burn out. Several collapsed from the fumes. The fires were contained, but not before sending dozens to the medical wing. It was another reminder, the jail wasn't just failing, it was becoming unlivable. The secret everyone knew. City leaders didn't want the public to see the truth. Official reports downplayed the violence. Words like incident or disturbance replaced riot and collapse. But leaked videos told a different story. Inmates walking freely through hallways, guards hiding behind barricaded office doors, trash piling up like mountains. One clip showed something chilling, an entire cell block chanting, "We run Rikers now." That wasn't just a threat. It was reality. The night of no return. Then came the night that pushed Rikers Island past the point of saving. A blackout hit the island. Lights died. Electronic locks failed. For hours, chaos reigned in the dark. Inmates lit makeshift torches from burning mattresses. Officers huddled together, radios useless. The sound of metal slamming against doors echoed through every block. When power finally returned, it revealed a scene of destruction. Doors ripped off hinges, guards injured, and inmates openly taunting the system. That was the night Rikers Island officially crossed the line, from a broken jail to a collapsing one. The bridge of no escape. Rikers Island is connected to the city by just one bridge. On a normal day, it's guarded, secure, and busy with vans, ambulances, and buses. But during the crisis, even that bridge became a symbol of collapse. Ambulances lined up, waiting to take injured inmates and officers to city hospitals. But with fights breaking out constantly, more patients piled up than the system could handle. Guards whispered about the unthinkable. What if someone makes a run across the bridge? It never happened that night. But the fear was enough. Everyone knew the bridge was no longer just an entrance. It was a possible escape route. And that fear spread through the entire city. Inside the forgotten dorms. Away from the chaos in the main cell blocks, the dorm-style units, where dozens of inmates slept in one room, were turning into war zones. Beds were torn apart and used as barricades. The strong preyed on the weak. Inmates whispered that gangs now decided who ate, who showered, and who lived in peace. Officers were too few to intervene. One chilling story spread. A single inmate who refused to hand over his food tray was dragged into the bathroom and left beaten unconscious. By the time officers arrived, the unit was silent, pretending nothing had happened. The system was eating itself alive. The officers' breaking point. Not only were inmates suffering, so were the officers. Working double and triple shifts, some collapsed from exhaustion. Others faced mental breakdowns. One officer wrote in a private letter, "Every day I go in, I wonder if I'll come out. Nobody listens. Nobody cares. We are abandoned." The letter leaked. Families of officers demanded answers. But officials insisted, "Things are under control." That very night, another tear erupted. This time, an officer was cornered and slashed across the face with a sharpened piece of metal. The breaking point wasn't coming. It was already here. The numbers don't lie. Behind the scenes, the statistics were terrifying. Assaults at record highs. Suicides climbing. Medical emergencies nearly doubling. Rikers was no longer functioning as a jail. It was a humanitarian disaster. And yet, every time the numbers were released, they were buried in paperwork and bureaucratic language. Words like incident rate increase replaced the brutal truth. People were dying and the system couldn't stop it. But numbers alone couldn't capture the horror. Only what happened next could. The collapse in broad daylight. It was a sunny afternoon when it happened. Broad daylight, no excuses. An entire unit of inmates refused orders. They flipped tables, blocked cameras with sheets, and turned the dorm into their own territory. Guards tried to enter, but they were pushed back by sheer numbers. For hours, the inmates controlled the unit. Reporters outside the jail caught wind of the event. And for the first time, the collapse of Rikers Island wasn't just whispered inside. It was visible to the entire world. The silence of the cells. After the daylight takeover, something strange happened. Silence. For a few days, the cell block seemed calmer. Fewer shouts. Fewer alarms. But officers quickly realized it wasn't peace, it was plotting. Inmates whispered through air vents, tapping messages on pipes. Rumors spread of a coordinated action, something bigger than a simple fight. The calm was only the eye of the storm. And then it hit. The mass sick-out. Just as tensions boiled, officers reached their limit. Hundreds called out sick, some legitimately ill, others simply refusing to return to what they called a death trap. That morning, whole sections of the jail were left with almost no staff. Inmates roamed freely, banging on doors and chanting. A single officer trapped in a control booth shouted into his radio, "I can't hold this tier. I'm alone in here." City leaders scrambled to bring in replacements, but it was too late. The balance of power tipped again, this time harder than ever. The court of chaos. Even the court system was collapsing. Detainees missed hearings because buses never arrived. Lawyers complained that their clients were vanishing in the system for weeks. One judge, frustrated with delays, said openly, "Rikers is no longer functioning as a jail." Those words echoed beyond the courthouse. Families of inmates demanded answers. Reporters pressed harder. But while the outside world argued, inside the jail, the chaos was reaching new levels. The flood. Late one night, a pipe burst in one of the aging buildings. Water poured across the floor, flooding cells ankle deep. Inmates climbed onto their bunks, shouting at guards through the waterlogged chaos. The flooding shorted out electrical wires, sending sparks across the tier. The jail turned into a drowning, smoking nightmare. One inmate yelled, "This place is falling apart. They can't stop it." And in that moment he was right. The breaking point. After years of warnings, after riots, fires, blackouts, and floods, Rikers Island was no longer just unstable. It was broken. Guards feared walking the tiers. Inmates ruled entire dorms. City leaders admitted the truth in private, even if they denied it in public. The collapse of Rikers Island wasn't coming in the future. It was happening right now. The ticking time bomb. Rikers Island wasn't just a jail anymore. It had become a living, breathing monster waiting to explode. Everyone inside knew it. The walls were cracking, the floors were crumbling, and the air itself felt heavy, thick with anger, fear, and despair. Officers compared every shift to walking into a war zone. They were supposed to be the ones in control, but more and more, they admitted privately that the inmates were calling the shots. Gangs ruled the housing units. Contraband flowed like water. Even the cafeteria was no longer neutral ground. If you weren't in a crew, you didn't eat. And yet, the city kept pretending things were manageable. Leaders issued statements full of polished words like staffing challenges and infrastructure issues. But ask anyone who worked a tier and they'd tell you the truth. Rikers wasn't facing challenges. Rikers was collapsing from the inside out. One officer remembered walking into a housing unit alone. Dozens of eyes followed him as he stepped through the door. The silence was worse than shouting, because silence meant the inmates were watching, waiting, testing. He realized at that moment that if anything happened, nobody would come fast enough to save him. His hands shook as he held his radio, praying he wouldn't need it. That fear wasn't isolated. It was spreading. And everyone inside could feel the countdown ticking closer and closer to disaster. The inmates take control. It started small. A group of inmates refusing orders. A guard hesitating before stepping forward. But once hesitation entered the air, the balance shifted. One dorm turned their beds into barricades, flipping them sideways, tying sheets into makeshift walls. They blocked cameras with towels and hung messages written in marker on cardboard. "We run this block now." When officers tried to intervene, they were met with a wall of bodies. No weapons, just numbers and the confidence that nothing would happen to them. The officers retreated, radios buzzing, voices tight with panic. Inside that barricaded dorm, the rules changed. Gangs held court sessions, deciding disputes between inmates. They controlled commissary, food distribution, even shower times. The jail had officially lost control of its own space. The strangest part? 4 hours, no one from administration even tried to regain it. The collapse wasn't sudden, it was silent, creeping, happening right in front of everyone. And yet, no one stopped it. The day the city found out. 4 years, the chaos inside Rikers was hidden from the outside world. Families complained, activists shouted, but officials always denied the scale of the problem. That changed the day video leaked. The footage spread across the news and social media within hours. It showed inmates walking freely through hallways, doors unlocked, trash piled high against the walls. Guards were seen hiding inside offices, using desks and chairs to barricade themselves. And then, the most shocking part, a group of inmates chanting in unison, "This is our island now." The reaction was immediate. The public was horrified. Politicians scrambled, demanding answers. But behind the cameras, everyone already knew the truth. This wasn't new. It had been happening for years. The only difference now was that the world could finally see it. But exposure didn't solve the problem. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, inmates inside felt even more emboldened, realizing the outside world was watching the system unravel in real time. The firestorm. Late one night, smoke began pouring out of a housing unit. Inmates had lit mattresses and plastic bins on fire, filling the tier with choking black clouds. Alarms wailed, red lights flashing across the grimy walls. But when officers tried to rush in, they couldn't. The smoke was too thick, visibility near zero. Locked doors and broken ventilation systems turned the fire into a trap. Prisoners pounded on the walls, coughing, screaming for air. Some laughed, banging metal against pipes, reveling in the chaos. It took nearly an hour before the flames were controlled. By then, several inmates and officers had collapsed from smoke inhalation. The fire wasn't just a protest. It was a warning. A reminder that every single day Rikers Island teetered on the edge of catastrophe, one spark away from complete collapse. And everyone wondered, if they couldn't control a fire, how could they control the island itself? The blackout. If there was one moment that symbolized the collapse of Rikers Island, it was the blackout. One summer evening, the lights flickered, and then died. Darkness swallowed the tears. The hum of cameras and locks faded into silence. For the first time in decades, inmates found themselves in control of an island without power. Some lit makeshift torches from burning paper and cloth. Others used the dark as cover to move through corridors, banging on doors, testing boundaries. Guards, terrified and blind, clutched their radios, hoping for backup that never came. In the chaos, one housing unit erupted. Inmates ripped metal from the walls, smashed windows, and screamed into the night sky. The sound carried across the East River, to the city that had long ignored them. When power finally returned, the destruction was breathtaking. Cell doors broken, cameras smashed, and walls covered in graffiti that read, "No more cages. No more control." That blackout wasn't just a technical failure. It was a metaphor. The lights had gone out on Rikers Island, and they weren't coming back. The human cost. By now, the collapse of Rikers wasn't just measured in statistics. It was written on the bodies and minds of the people trapped inside. Inmates lived in constant fear, never knowing if they'd wake up to a fight, a fire, or a flood. Some hadn't seen court dates in months, left waiting in limbo. Others fell into despair so deep they attempted to take their own lives. Every week, the medical unit filled with men scarred not only by violence but by hopelessness. And it wasn't just inmates who suffered. Correctional officers, once proud to wear the uniform, were breaking down. Families said their loved ones came home from shifts shaking, unable to sleep, haunted by screams and the smell of smoke on their clothes. Officers admitted to drinking heavily, drowning stress just to make it through another day. One officer's wife told reporters, "He doesn't talk anymore. He just stares at the wall." Rikers took the man I married. The collapse of the jail wasn't contained by its walls. It was spilling out into the lives of everyone touched by it. The court of public opinion. Outside the island, the battle was now political. City officials were split. Some called for immediate closure, arguing the jail was a stain on New York's name. Others demanded it stay open, fearing chaos would spill into city streets if inmates were moved. Protests erupted outside City Hall. Families of inmates held signs reading, "Shut Rikers now." Meanwhile, correctional officers marched with their own banners, "Protect staff. Fix the system." The public was caught in the middle. On one side, horrific stories of abuse, neglect, and death. On the other, warnings of what would happen if the city lost its last line of control. Every news cycle brought a new headline, "Another death at Rikers." Inmates take over housing unit. Mayor promises action. But promises weren't enough. Inside the jail, the collapse only deepened. The chain reaction. The collapse of Rikers didn't stay on the island, it spread. Court delays grew worse. City hospitals filled with inmate injuries. Police officers on the streets found themselves arresting the same people over and over, knowing they'd be sent to a jail that could no longer hold them safely. It was a chain reaction. One weak link snapping after another. Lawyers warned of lawsuits that could bankrupt the city. Human rights groups called Rikers a humanitarian disaster zone. Even federal officials began circling, preparing to step in. But the scariest chain reaction was the one nobody wanted to admit. If Rikers collapsed completely, the entire justice system of New York would collapse with it. The boiling point. All of it, the riots, the fires, the blackouts, the floods, built toward one inevitable conclusion. On a sweltering afternoon, tensions inside reached a boiling point. Two rival gangs clashed in a dormitory. With few officers present, the fight exploded into a full-scale brawl. Beds were flipped, glass shattered, blood pooled on the floors. Desperate calls for backup echoed through radios. But reinforcements couldn't get in fast enough. For nearly an hour, the inmates ruled the dorm, turning it into a battlefield. When order was finally restored, the damage was undeniable. Dozens injured, both inmates and officers. The dorm was uninhabitable. Reporters outside called it, "the day Rikers fell apart." But inside, people whispered a darker truth. This wasn't the day it fell apart. This was proof it had already fallen. The point of no return. By now, everyone knew the truth. Rikers Island was beyond saving. The buildings were crumbling. The staff was broken. The inmates had seized control of entire spaces. And the city's leaders, after years of denial, were finally forced to admit it publicly. Plans were announced to shut the jail down. But even that came with chaos. Closing Rikers meant moving thousands of inmates, rebuilding entire systems, and finding answers the city didn't have. And through it all, one question lingered: how had America's most notorious jail reached a point where collapse wasn't just possible, it was unstoppable? Perfect. Let's bring this story to a cinematic, powerful close. I'll tie everything together in an outro that feels like the final beat of a documentary, haunting, emotional, and thought-provoking, leaving viewers with that "I have to share this" feeling. The collapse nobody could stop. Rikers Island was never just a jail. It was a warning. For decades, it stood as a symbol of punishment, fear, and control. But over time, the cracks in its walls grew into fractures too deep to repair. Riots, fires, floods, blackouts, the signs were everywhere. Inmates suffered. Officers broke. Families grieved. And the city denied. Until the denial could no longer hold. The truth is simple and terrifying. Rikers Island didn't collapse overnight. It collapsed slowly, piece by piece, while the world looked away. And by the time everyone paid attention, it was already too late. Now, as the city scrambles to shut it down, one question remains. If the most infamous jail in America can collapse in plain sight, what does that say about the system holding it up? Because Rikers may be closing. But the problems that destroyed it, they're still out there. Waiting. Growing. And maybe, just maybe, the collapse has only just begun.